Welcome to CSIS. Thank you for coming out. I think this will be a really good event. I'm looking forward to it. So let me say who our speakers are. Michael Brown, who's the director of the Defense Innovation Unit, Department of Defense, out in California. Thomas Feddo, Assistant Secretary for Investment Security, Department of Treasury. I said Matthew Borman. I didn't change it. Matthew Borman had to go to a 2 p.m. meeting with the secretary. So maybe that's good news, right? But in his place, we have an old friend, Eileen Albanese, who's the director of the National Security and Technology Transfer Controls Office. And then finally, David Hankey, a partner at Arendt Fox LLP. And we are arguing over what title we should give him in the back. So is it architect? Sounded like architect of the Capitol, but someone who was involved in the legislation that's brought us all here today. My name's Jim Lewis. About a couple years ago, in large part because of a report that Mike put out, the U.S. decided that it needed to take a second look at technology transfer to China. We had, for a long time, assumed that this would work out okay, that the risks, while there were risks, they were manageable and would decrease over time as China became a friend. That turned out not to be true, so you've seen significant legislative change last year, and now a host of administration initiatives to implement those changes. So what we'll talk about today in very general terms is how is it working? Where could it be strengthened? What could we do differently? What could be improved? So with that, the order will be Michael will speak first, followed by Thomas, and then Eileen, and then Dave. If you have some remarks, we can follow. And we'll go to me asking a few questions, and then we'll open the floor to you for questions as well. So with that, Michael.
Okay. Thanks, Jim. Thanks for hosting this event and having us here. Pretty important topic. As Jim said, the reason I'm here is not so much because I'm the director of the Defense Innovation Unit, which, if you don't know, was formed by Ash Carter in 2015 so we could get more commercial technology into the military. But for some work that I did for the 2 years prior, I was in a presidential fellow role and wrote something that's now called the DIUX report, which looked at Chinese investment in early stage technology and how was that useful for transferring technology back to China. So I thought I'd use my time today to talk a little bit about those two topics. Let's see if we can. I need the refresher.
There we go.
Oh, but we lost the full screen mode. Oh, here we go. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about what are the stakes with technology transfer. So a couple of things here. The first one from the IP Commission that you probably recognize, an estimate that there's 600 billion lost annually. And this is obviously not just a threat from a dollar standpoint, but there's a lot of high-paying jobs that are at stake here with these industries. My point here with this slide is we tend to focus on what are the near-term direct costs, and then a lot of the longer-term costs get a bit of short shrift. We'll talk a little bit about that. So notice that that number is significant enough that if over a decade, that 600 billion would actually close the gap in GDP between the two countries, the US and China. We're also aware that US companies will lose market share over time. This is exactly what China has in mind with the Made in China 2025 plan, which in my view is a large import substitution plan to transfer economic output from other countries to China. But the longer term issues are ones that I think are worth reflecting on. Over time, it makes U.S. businesses much less competitive. We're not talking about just 1 year's loss of revenue, but we're talking about many orders larger than that over time, and maybe more significantly, first mover advantage, network effects, and the ability to set standards are lost. So let's use 4G to 5G as an example, and I'm going to read to you from a report that was written by Recon Analytics. They published a report in April 2018 estimating that the introduction of 4G contributed 70% growth in the wireless industry between 2011 and 2014 and bolstered jobs in the wireless industry by 80%. So this is the advantage of being a first mover. So by leading the charge, the U.S. was able to build a global ecosystem of network providers, device manufacturers, and app developers that shape the future of 4G. So if you take that example and then you multiply that by all of the industries that China has in mind with Made in China 2025, you'd be talking about an enormous loss in this first mover advantage and economic output. And then, probably like many of you, I believe that national security and economic security are inextricably linked. So it's this loss in economic security over time that means a loss of national security. Some of the consequences we recognize here: loss of advantage in terms of the technology capability the military has access to, and then over time that means we have fewer levers to shape what the U.S. wants to do, both from a global technology standpoint and also what are the values that are highlighted around the world as ones to be looked up to. So we are in a period now where China continues to grow faster as an economy than the U.S. None of us alive have been through a period where there is a larger economy than the U.S., so some uncharted territory. And the U.S. has set technological standards for the last 50 to 80 years since World War II. So imagine the industries of computing, networking, biotech, software, aircraft design in a world where the U.S. had not been setting the standards. Imagine what the world would look like if China was setting the standards in 6 game-changing technologies: hypersonics, AI, quantum sciences, 5G, genetic engineering, and space. I would argue, and 5 of those 6 technologies are so-called dual use, so they're not just military technologies, hypersonics being the exception there. They're dual use. They're as important or more important for economic prosperity because they're commercial technologies. Well, you don't have to imagine, because China's already setting the pace for a number of those technologies. Hypersonics included, where the U.S. is playing a catch-up game. AI, where facial recognition, China's already ahead of the U.S. Quantum sciences, where China launched the first quantum communications satellite in 2016, the MISSIA satellite. 5G, with the activities of Huawei. Genetic engineering, where because there's no reciprocity in data sharing between China and the U.S., and we've used Chinese equipment for genome sequencing, China has more data on the genetic sequencing of the U.S. population than we have here in the U.S. And space, where China last year had more launches into space than the U.S. did. So clearly under President Xi, the period of hide and bide your time is over, and China already sets themselves the goal of being the technology leader by 2049, and they want to be leading in a lot more industries. So, in the report that Jim mentioned, we set out a technology transfer policy toolkit. This is pretty remarkably similar to what you saw in Jim Lewis's report, which I thought was excellent on this topic. And really, he talks about balancing the need for what we do to increase economic security. I would agree with him completely. The challenge here is to maximize our economic prosperity, not to minimize the technology that gets transferred. And that's the way we'll make sure that we have national security included here. So we broke this here into 2 different sets of policies, and I'll talk about each one briefly. One would be the defensive policies. This, unfortunately, is what we seem to be spending the overwhelming majority of our time talking about. And I would argue that what we really need to be spending the majority of our time talking about is the proactive policies. Well, okay, let's talk about defensive first. So what we've known that Congress has worked on, largely through the work of Dave Hankey, the work on FIRMA, which strengthened the CFIUS process, and also along with that came export reform, export control reform, which Eileen and Thomas are working on now. Our perspective on that would be that we want to minimize the technologies covered, so we want to make sure this is not blanket, and we want there to be a continuous review process because things change so quickly in this area. And key, and Jim pointed this out, is cooperation with allies. If we don't have policies that are coordinated with allies, we really have done nothing but raise barriers in the U.S. without ensuring that the technology is not transferred. The one area that I'll take exception with Jim and his report is the end-user controls. I think, frankly, that would be a naive approach. The argument is that as long as we understand who the end user is or what the end use is of the technology to be transferred, we'll be able to effectively make sure it's in the right hands. As we know from what China's done with civil-military fusion and now the law that they're implementing, the Internet Cybersecurity Law of 2016, where they're going to have access to all information. There'll be no longer any VPNs, no exceptions for foreign entities or joint ventures. They're going to have access to all information flowing. It really won't matter whether it's a private company, so-called private company in China, or it's the PLA. It's all open for the taking by the Chinese government. Two of the things that Jim mentioned that I also agree with that we haven't done as much on is retaining the graduate students in STEM that are studying here in the U.S. 25% of the STEM graduate students in the U.S. are Chinese foreign nationals. As immigration has been so important to bolstering Silicon Valley, Route 128, and the other innovation hubs, we need to make sure we're attracting world-class talent, and I think there should be an effort to retain as many of those students as possible. And then counterintelligence. We've got to recognize that along with that comes the risk that some of those folks are not interested just in economics, but also interested in transferring the technology. When we did the report, the DIOX report back in 2016, 2017, the Palo Alto office of the FBI had 10 agents. So we're woefully understaffed for the scale of the problem. Well, let's shift gears to talk about what I think we could be doing that would make a real difference here, and that is recommit to global preeminence in science. Be the leaders in these key technologies, the game-changing technologies we talked about a minute ago, and make sure our capacity for domestic innovation and technology adoption is without peer. That would require an increase in the budget for federally funded R&D. Our federally funded R&D at this point is 0.7% of GDP. That was 2% in the 1960s. And half of that 0.7 is spent in the health areas, National Institutes of Health. So great as far as that goes, but that's certainly not helping our military capability. Our percentage of federal funding as a percentage of GDP has now fallen behind China, Japan, Korea, Finland, Sweden, Denmark, and Germany. This is not a strategy to win what I think is going to be a superpower marathon between us and China for technology dominance. So the reason it's important to invest in federally funded R&D is that's the source of so much economic prosperity. We're still benefiting from the investment that we made in the 60s and 70s that gave us the internet, GPS, miniaturized electronics, all the things that you see startups even today in Silicon Valley going public on. We need that investment today so that we'll continue to have economic prosperity 20, 30, 40, 50 years from now. That's the kind of long-term horizon China takes. Second thing would be ensuring that our commercial sector is every bit as vibrant in terms of R&D investment. That has implications for what does the R&D tax credit look like? How do we change our capital markets so they're not so short-term oriented, so that we're not sending all our manufacturing offshore, all our hardware offshore? That's not going to help our national security interests. STEM education, so that we change the tide. Our graduates in STEM are declining. China now graduates 10 times the number of engineers that we do. And finally, let's get back to doing some moonshots and rally around national purpose for innovation that brings the triangle back together, academia, business, and government. It's this kind of activity that basically led to Silicon Valley, as we know, and we seem to have lost a little bit of the formula, but we know how to get that back. It's in our DNA. So I would argue that while a lot of what we spend our time on is the defense, we really need to be thinking about how can we commit ourselves to the proactive policies that will make sure we have a economic prosperity that extends for decades, and that's the best way we will be ensuring our own national security. Thank you very much.
Well, that was cheery.
You picked the topic, Jim.
Thomas, would you come up? You can use the podium or you can use the chair.
Yeah, I'm comfortable here. Okay. Good afternoon. As Dr. Lewis mentioned, I'm Tom Fetto, and I serve as the Assistant Secretary of the Treasury for Investment Security, and I oversee Treasury's chair of the Committee on Foreign Investment in the United States. And for those who are not familiar, and I doubt it's few in this audience, CFIUS reviews certain foreign investments of U.S. businesses for the potential effects on national security by virtue of those investments. As Dr. Lewis's report mentions and focuses on some of the key challenges that CFIUS faces in its daily work, I think it rightly recommends that, that we have a flexible, nimble, and multifaceted approach and response to these challenges. Before speaking to the ways in which CFIUS deals with potential tech transfer risks, I'd like to emphasize at the outset that foreign direct investment is vital to the U.S. economy and to U.S. national security. Among other things, it supports continued innovation in and the growth of our most cutting-edge industries. And the U.S. welcomes FDI, foreign direct investment, and remains open for business. However, you'll hear me say often that not all foreign investment is benign, and that's where CFIUS can step in. There are core aspects to how CFIUS operates that enable the United States to continue attracting benign foreign investment while ensuring that our national security interests are protected. CFIUS is just one tool in the national security toolbox. It analyzes each transaction on a case-by-case basis. That is, it looks to the risk arising from that transaction. And the way we do our work is robust and analytically rigorous. We focus exclusively on national security and not broader economic or other policy interests. We're not a country screen or a sector screen. And we work with and complement many other national security tools, and you'll hear a little bit more about that today, especially in the export control context. And CFIUS will act with respect to a transaction when those other tools are not adequate to address the national security concern. And we like to and drive to be proportional in our approach with respect to a national security risk. With respect to tech transfer specifically, I'll briefly discuss three areas in which CFIUS deals with tech transfer concerns. One's through our law and regulations and our proposed regulations. One's during our cases, our reviews and investigations, as we refer to them. And the other is through our international engagement. First, Congress broadened CFIUS's authority to better address national security concerns arising from some types of transactions that were previously outside its jurisdiction. The traditional jurisdiction of CFIUS is with respect to investments where a foreign person gains control of a U.S. business. And that jurisdiction will remain post-FIRMA, post-implementation, but there's new aspects to this. One is that CFIUS has the authority to review certain non-controlling but non-passive investments in U.S. businesses with critical technology to identify those national security concerns. And for those who practice in the CFIUS area or follow our work, you'll know that last year we quickly exercised those new authorities after the law was passed in August to protect certain critical technology and certain intellectual property through what we referred to as a critical technology pilot program, implementing some of the authority that the Congress gave us through the new law with respect to 27 identified industries. The pilot's still in effect and will be throughout the finalization of the final FIRMA rule, and we're still considering what the complexion of potential mandatory filings with respect to critical technology will look like post-implementation. Last month, we published the proposed regulations to implement all of FIRMA, and they must be effective no later than February of next year. At that point, CFIUS will be able to review non-passive and non-controlling investments in U.S. businesses that design, test, manufacture, fabricate, or develop critical technology as it's defined in the statute involving any industry, not just those 27 that are the subject of the pilot program. Notably, I think important for this discussion today, the definition of critical technology connects to the Export Control Reform Act of 2018, And when the Commerce Department identifies emerging or foundational technologies, they immediately become part of the definition of critical technology under FIRMA and are then within our jurisdiction. Again, I mentioned earlier, we're going to retain our traditional jurisdiction over what we call controlled transactions. We've gotten a lot of comments from the public comment period, and we're carefully considering those and looking forward to refining parts of the rule where we got great feedback. Our goal is to provide as much clarity as possible to the public while at the same time protecting our national security in the final rule. So we want to maintain that open investment environment that I referred to at the outset, but we want to use these new tools in a targeted, tailored way that's clear for the investing community. If you haven't read the draft rule or the comments, I encourage you to do so. And we've got a lot of material on our website that pertains to how we do our work. The second thing is, while CFIUS is still clearing the majority of its cases without what we refer to as mitigation or national security agreements, the number of mitigation agreements has grown. And that's a direct function of the number of the transactions we review each year. That number is actually a small fraction of the total number of investments from foreign direct investment that occur every year. But with respect to those, we're seeing an increasing number of mitigation agreements that resolve the national security risk that we identify in a transaction. When we do national security agreements through this mitigation, we require the businesses that are involved to take specific and verifiable steps. We're also building within Treasury, as the chair, the steward of the CFIUS process, an office that's dedicated to enforcement of these mitigation agreements. So we're going to be spending more and more time making sure that the committee is exercising its oversight authority, encouraging compliance, and building an environment that fosters compliance with those agreements with the government. Lastly, we're working with allies and partners, and FIRMA specifically directs the committee to do that. And we're trying to be a leader on investment screening. So I can tell you my team and we've engaged with a number of our allies and partners, several dozen over the last year and a half that I've been with Treasury, through bilateral engagement, multilateral engagement, to share best practices, to encourage other countries, our allies and partners, to build investment screening tools that maintain that open investment environment but focus on national security like we do. And that will be central to an effective implementation of FIRMA on the long horizon. I look forward to the rest of the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Thomas. Could you now give us some remarks? Thank you.
So with the passage of the Export Control Reform Act of 2018, it did a lot of things regarding export controls, but one of the things it did do was to require the president to establish a formal and continuous process for identifying emerging and foundational technologies. This is not something new to the Bureau of Industry and Security or to the Department of Commerce. It is something we have done continuously, not so much in a formal structure under what was decided in the Export Control Reform Act, but through our multilateral regimes and through the Wassenaar arrangement, through the Australia group, through the MTCR, and through the Nuclear Suppliers Group. So this is not a new concept for the Bureau of Industry and Security, but it was an initiative to formalize the structure. So we have done that at the Department of Commerce. One of the things that the Export Control Reform Act required us to do is to take into consideration a number of things. To take into consideration multilateral agreement, to take into consideration the impact of any controls on innovation in the United States, Foreign, what impact there may be on development in foreign countries. So it required us to take all those things into account. It also encouraged us and required us to look at other avenues, not just our own internal processes, but what comes out of CFIUS, what comes out of commodity jurisdiction agreements or commodity jurisdiction discussions. And this is where a company will come into the Department of State and say, I have this thing. I don't know where it is controlled. Is it under State Department munitions? Is it under the Commerce? So that's an avenue for identifying those things that are emerging. Take that into consideration. And take into consideration the advice and discussions with the technical advisory committees. So all those things were included in the Export Control Reform Act. In late 2018, we issued an advanced notice of proposed rulemaking to help us to identify emerging technologies. That AMPR listed 14 technology areas. Some people have confused those technology areas with that is what the emerging technologies are. That is not the case. Those were general areas of consideration. And we asked people to comment on not only those areas, but what things we should look at, what sources we might be able to tap, what should be sort of the guidelines or things that we should consider as we go forward. We got over 200 comments, and they're all posted. Most, as you might imagine, were comments such as, don't touch me, I'm good. There were one or two comments which said, oh, not me, but him. You know, you should really look at him. So what we have done in the Department of Commerce is we have created teams around those 14 initial technology areas. And we have team leaders that are assigned or are required to go out and talk to people, talk to the labs, talk to the intelligence community, talk to venture capitalists, talk to people in an attempt to identify those emerging technologies that are essential to the national security of the United States. It's a hard job because one of the things that we need to do at the Department of Commerce is we need to identify those emerging technologies in a way that everybody can recognize. That for those people who want to comply, they can comply. And for those people who don't comply, there's enough information for our enforcement agencies to take action. So it's very important that we have specificity. As most of you will understand, it's not an easy project. We have been successful in a couple of areas, though. We issued in emerging technologies Federal Register in early 2019, in which we identified 6 what we believe are emerging technologies that came out of the Wassenaar arrangement and the Australia group. We will continue to do that sort of rigorous review and analysis. Part of our job, too, and consistent with the Export Control Reform Act, is that when we identify an emerging technology that we think is essential to national security, that we solicit review and comment from the affected community, which we will continue to do. We have our technical advisory committees at Commerce, which are centered around the 10 categories of the Commerce Control List. Granted, people in those technical advisory committees are probably not on the cutting edge of emerging technologies, which is why we've established a new technical advisory committee called the Emerging Technology Technical Advisory Committee. And that will consist of both people from academia and venture capitalists and the labs and the intelligence community in an effort to provide the government with some advice and comment. We are hoping that our first meeting will be held sometime in late 2019, which is getting real close. So hopefully soon, and in which case we'll work with that technical advisory committee to help us refine those things that we believe are emerging technologies. And so with that, I will pass it on.
Great. Thank you, Eileen. It's really nice to have someone who can pinch hit on 90 minutes notice. So we really appreciate your coming here today.
Thank you.
David, closing remarks, final views?
Sure.
You're the one who started most. He actually started it, but you're the one that put the laws in place, so, or helped architect them.
Well,
what do you want to say?
Yes, I'll talk about that in a minute if you want. But, thank you, Jim. It's great to be here. I'm between two friends and two great public servants, so it's a real honor to be on the stage as the token private sector guy. But we can
After a
talk.
career in public service yourself.
9 months ago, government, now private sector. But this is a really important topic, and I'm really glad to be here to talk about it. I don't think Eileen or Tom used the word China, but Mike did. So I'll put a finer point on what Mike said, because I agree with 100% what he said. There's some great thoughts in there. But I think when it comes to China, the reality is that it represents the foremost national security challenge of our lifetime. I'm not trying to be hyperbolic. I think that's just the way we need to think about this. Unfortunately, a lot of policymakers in DC have not yet wrapped their heads around the scope and the scale of this problem. It really is very, very serious. And we should all be alarmed by the prospect of a world in which China is the dominant superpower militarily, economically, technologically. I think that's just the way to think about it. Looking at CFIUS, so Jim, you're right. So Mike's analysis in his 2017-2018 study really spurred a lot of what we did in FIRMA when I was working on Capitol Hill for Senator John Cornyn. His analysis, his work was really essential to that process. And then when Tom came in and his team, they really helped us refine it, build it out, and really make it what it was in the end stage. But the FIRMA bill was really aimed at the weaponization of investment, which is just one piece of the problem. Congress was trying to do two things: to close the gaps in the CFIUS jurisdiction, but also to address some shortcomings in the export control system. We talked about that a little bit already, but that's really important. But I like to think that FIRMA made CFIUS both more relevant in terms of today's national security risks, but also more efficient. And Tom can really go into detail on that if he wants to. But those are two really important things that we strove, I don't know, where's the grammar police, to accomplish there. And hopefully we did that. But implementing FIRMA is a really difficult task, so I'm really pleased that Tom took it on, and congrats to him on his recent Senate confirmation. We're lucky that people of this caliber on this stage are willing to serve today. So thank you, Tom. But they've done a good job so far. The pilot program, I think, written in 60 days was really almost remarkable with its, there have been criticisms, but it was really in 60 days that they turned that out with the nuance and the complicated subject matter was really a testament, I think, to the folks at Treasury. I think you have to grade it both in terms of its process and in terms of its substance. We can get into that a little bit later. But I think on the process, they really deserve a B+, maybe an A- in terms of 60 days. He wanted an A+, but we're going to go with it's a scaled score. But I think in the substance, that's where I really had some concerns, and that really goes to what Eileen's talking about with the emerging technology controls, and we can talk about that as well. But it's interesting to point out that there were really zero investments involving emerging technologies that have been reviewed under the pilot, and that goes to the substance of the pilot. I think that's really unfortunate, considering FIRMA and ECRO both enacted 14 months ago. 0 deals, that's really, really unfortunate. So today that means that state-connected, problematic Russian and Chinese investors can still invest in our most cutting-edge technologies with 0 US government scrutiny, which is it's a bit alarming if you ask me. Skipping on to emerging and foundational technologies. So that was a key part of ECRA. And it was also one of the major disagreements on Capitol Hill in terms of that legislation. It was over which agency should decide, which technologies CFIUS should be able to review. And of course, you've got key players at CFIUS. You've got DOD, you've got Commerce, you've got State, Homeland Security. I'm sure everybody wanted a role to play. In the end, the compromise was that Commerce would be essentially unilaterally in charge of deciding, with input from the interagency, but unilaterally in charge of deciding which emerging technologies would be reviewed. And I think there have been some concerns about that, partly for the reason that I mentioned a moment ago. But I know members of Congress are growing a bit impatient with the lack of controls on emerging technologies. I'm not here to say whether they should be broad or super narrow. That's for the experts to decide. But Congress, I have heard about a bit of concern, a bit of frustration, and so it's possible that issue could be revisited as far as amendments to the legislation at some point. But since I'm not inhibited by being a government servant like these three, I can propose new policy, which is always fun. And so I think in Mike's speech, he talked about IP theft, which is really, really important. And it's the one area where I think, the one sort of avenue of tech transfer where I think the US government has really not done much of anything. And I think there's a lot of work to be done here. It's an even more serious concern, I think, than the other two, frankly. And much of China's technological advancements have really come at the direct expense of the United States. And this is really the sort of driving reason for that. And the list of victims, of course, are not just universities, purely commercial companies, but also defense contractors. So this has very real national security impacts that we need to pay attention to. And these companies need help from the US government. So the Trump administration's paid attention to this. They're taking it seriously. But so far, the solutions have been prosecute. The Justice Department has a new China initiative, which is laudable. But you can't prosecute your way out of this problem with IP theft. It's just not possible. The USTR thinks that tariffs are an appropriate response, but I think it's just too blunt of an instrument to really achieve anything. So I think instead there needs to be a more targeted approach, and I think you could really you need to do three things. You need to raise the actual costs on the IP thieves, on the bad actors. You need to deter them from stealing IP in the first place. And then you need to reduce their ability to monetize the theft of this intellectual property. Those are three key objectives you need to do. But I think, to be fair to companies who are both on both sides of this problem, there needs to be a very clear legal framework in place to do this. You can't just write some executive order in 5 minutes and crank it out. It's got to be a very clear, well thought out legal framework. It's got to have confidentiality where companies can report IP theft to agencies of the US government. It's got to have the ability for federal agencies to review evidence. Certain agencies are very good at weighing the evidence and deciding whether a certain threshold is met. You've got to have the ability for adverse action to be kind of baked in as an automatic consequence. And I think this may or may not warm Tom's heart, but I think CFIUS Lite would be a good way to think about this. There could be a body of agencies that you could draw from the CFIUS membership that could be sort of the receivers of this information. They could convene and weigh the evidence, review the impacts to national security, which should be first, I think, amongst the considerations, and then make determinations as to whether the evidence is enough. There should be a very defined process and the ability to leverage existing authorities. And some of those consequences, and I'll wrap up after this, is there should be public naming and shaming of bad actors who are stealing US intellectual property. You can't overstate the impact of that. I think we should use economic sanctions. I think there's authority on the books, the 2015 Executive Order, 2015 Defense Authorization Act, that gives authority, especially for cyber-enabled situations, to leverage, to impose sanctions on bad actors. I think we should use the entity list, and perhaps Eileen has a thought on this, but if you think about restricting the ability of a bad actor to access the US supply chain, that's a very powerful tool. And in fact, IP theft really is an unauthorized export of technology. It's really an undermining and an evasion of our export control rules, so I think it's perfectly appropriate to think about it in those terms. So I will stop yapping and turn it back over to you, Jim, for questions and whatnot.
Great, thank you. This is kind of the dream team up here, so I have a whole range of questions.
Heaven help us.
I know. But I'll ask them a few, and then we'll turn it over to you to ask questions as well. So they've all agreed to answer, more or less, frankly. Let me start by asking about critical technologies and emerging and foundational technologies. And Dave, I guess we can blame you a little for this, but CFIUS talks about critical technologies, ECRA talks about emerging and foundational technologies. How close are we to defining these things? Anyone want to?
I'll start. I think the FIRMA defines critical technology. It sets out a number of subsets that are defined as critical technology, including items that are controlled under the EAR or the ITAR. I'll just, one point of clarification on the pilot program that I just want to make sure, because it is a little nuanced. The pilot program has looked at critical technology transactions. We've looked at quite a few over the course of the pilot program. I think the distinction that that you're making, Dave, is that with respect to the prong under critical technology, one of the sub-definitions is emerging and foundational technologies as defined by the commerce and the commerce process in ECRA. And what you're saying is that there's been zero with respect to that prong.
That's exactly right.
Okay. So in terms of definition, the statute for FIRMA, for CFIUS, already sets forth, our swim lanes on what critical technology is. I defer to commerce on the emerging tech piece of this.
Just people are thinking that commerce is going to come out with a list of items that are emerging technologies and almost have a special control called, ET next to it. What we are doing and what we have done, and as I said, we did issue 8 final rules which identified emerging technologies, and they went into basically the critical technologies. So they went to the commerce control list as something controlled for national security reasons or regional stability. So it could change, but at this point, you're not going to have an export control number on the commerce control list that says controlled for ET, emerging technologies. Those things will go into national security and regional stability, and part of that is because of the multilateral process. Everybody has said, if you don't have other supplier countries on board with controlling these things, all you're going to do is hurt U.S. industry. So that's why emerging technologies, except in very, very few cases I can imagine, would automatically go into the multilateral controlled national security, missile technology, Australia group controls. So we have identified emerging technologies. They have gone into the critical technologies list. And that is sort of what we intend to do. We do have the authority to do a unilateral control immediately, and we call it a 521. And that's when we actually see something that is right there, is about to be exported or about to be truly commercialized across the board. And we can unilaterally control that. Again, it won't be for emerging technologies, it will be for regional stability. And then that will go into, hopefully, the multilateral control process to gain multilateral consensus that something like that needs to be controlled.
Mike, you touched on emerging technologies in your remarks. From the DIU perspective, what do you think of when you think of emerging technologies?
So the concept that we were laying out in terms of foundational technologies were those technologies on which many future applications, innovations would be built upon. So if we were sitting back in the 1970s, the foundationals would be some of those I talked about, computing, networking, storage, right?
Right.
So if we look into the next period in the future, I think it's going to be AI, autonomy, genetic engineering, et cetera. Though we have to make sure we have leadership in those technologies, because those are the ones upon which many, many future innovations will be built. So when we thought about critical technology, we thought about it in that sense. These are the foundational technologies. And then emerging were just those that are coming on the scene now. Mm-hmm. So there's a lot of overlap in some of those that we'd say, AI being a good example of those.
Yes.
Yeah.
Dave, was that what you were thinking when you were helping to draft the legislation?
Well, not entirely. But Mike's,
that was a setup, wasn't it?
Mike's report predated the legislation, but the definition of critical technologies in this new category, emerging and foundational technologies, was essentially a compromise provision that was added to ECRA after a couple of food fights on Capitol Hill over certain issues. And I mentioned the first one about who should decide what is an emerging technology in terms of venture capital and other minority position deals. The other big food fight, which maybe was a bigger one, was over overseas joint ventures, where there's the transfer really of very mature, of know-how that's associated with very mature technologies, where essentially there's a U.S. company that is very forcefully invited to set up a joint venture in China with a Chinese joint venture partner, and then there's essentially engineers that are directly transferring know-how. And the technology itself has been downgraded or decontrolled, perhaps moved to Year 99 status or some type of lower status where no license would be required. But it's still very important for national security. So by definition, foundational tech still has to be essential for national security. This is under the ECRA definition, and that provision migrated from the CFIUS bill in the Senate, which is a long story. But the emerging stuff, also essential for national security. I think that goes directly to what Mike said, just emerging stuff. It's sort of self-explanatory. Foundational is more mature, very technology that's been around for a while, but that is still really important. So
Semiconductors.
Semiconductor is the classic case, exactly. So there's just a little clarification.
Let me switch gears a little bit. It seems like every administration since I arrived in Washington always asks itself at some point, should they revisit NSDD 189, the directive that says that basic and fundamental research should not be subject to government control. And in particular, this is a concern given the interest and the involvement of universities, not just in the US, but in other Western countries, in training the next generation of Chinese researchers. And we've had some remarkable incidents here. So maybe I can just go down the row. Eileen, when I start with you, since you've at least heard of NSD.
Really?
Yeah, sorry. What do you think? Time to take a second look at basic research? Time to tighten up on universities?
I think I'm going to just pass on that.
Okay. And there's been some ideas. If they're all going to pass, it's going to be a quick question. But, one option would be, oops. That's one way to get out of answering.
Exactly. Nope. There we go.
The question is, are there, some people have talked about banning students from China. Some people have talked about limiting it to undergraduates. So there's a range of things that have come up. On the other hand, if you talk to the universities, if you talk to some of the leading tech companies, they say, we need this talent. And we were laughing a little bit during, I think it was Mike's presentation, that keep people here. When was the first time you heard that, Eileen? You can answer that question.
Oh, keep people here. The first time
Staple a green card to the PhD.
Exactly, yeah.
What year?
20 years ago, at least?
Yeah. So it's an ongoing policy
Right.
issue.
It is.
Mike, do you want to touch the university question, the basic research question?
Well, I think on university question, probably made my point clear, and it's clear in the paper. Living in Silicon Valley or any of the innovation hubs, you see how important talent from around the world is. So it's pretty clear that it adds to our economic prosperity and therefore is pretty important for national security. We need to be developing the leading edge of those game-changing technologies here in the US. And to the extent that involves foreign talent, foreign capital to do that, we want to be encouraging that. But we don't want to be stupid about that and leave the barn door open. So along with that goes the appropriate resource for counterintelligence.
Right.
And as we said, we're woefully short relative to the scale of the problem. In fact, you could argue that we don't have enough resources on this problem to even know what the scale is. So that's why we're estimating with some pretty large numbers. I think we have the worst of both worlds now with respect to foreign students. We take a world-class resource of the United States, our educational system, and we allocate a big percentage of that for foreign students. In the case of China, 1/3 of the foreign student population in the US, Chinese foreign nationals. And I mentioned STEM education, 25% of the master's and PhD STEM students in the US, Chinese foreign nationals. So we've allocated a huge percentage, and then we send that educated talent home. So probably need to rationalize one side or the other so we don't live with the worst case. And I've already made my view clear. We need to be retaining as many of those folks as possible, but not counting on all of them to have good intentions.
Great, thank you. Dave?
I agree with what Mike said. I always agree with Mike whenever possible. He's much smarter than me. But I would say that we have a problem with sort of immigration politics, which is preventing, in this country for going on 10, 20 years, having a serious debate about immigration and national security. And as long as we have the sort of bipartisan, the partisan clashing over, over the border wall and over other immigration issues, we're not going to be able to have any kind of meaningful reforms to benefit national security. I think that's really unfortunate. So hopefully in the near term, we could, in the next several years, we could break that impasse and have a serious conversation about immigration and national security. But I also think at the same time, the State Department has some work to do in terms of how they vet candidates for student visas. I think from a counterintelligence standpoint, the system is far from perfect. So I'll leave it at that.
Great, thank you. Tom?
Yeah, I too think Mike gave a comprehensive answer.
Well, I would agree with Mike as well. So there, we got that one out of the way. Great. When you think about safe end users in China, and you brought this up, that's a hard issue to deal with. And so, some people would say, as we've heard, there really aren't any safe end users in China left anymore. Others, particularly among some of our European allies, would disagree with that. What do you think of when you raise the issue of safe end users in China? Tom, I hate to pick on you again, but when you look at Chinese investors, for example, are there ones you don't care about? Are they all in the question? What's the...
Yeah, so the brilliance, I think, of CFIUS and it continues in large part is reinforced by FIRMA is it's a transaction by transaction process, right, where we look at the risk arising from the transaction, and the threat piece, if you will, it's threat time. I say it's threat times vulnerability equals consequence, and so with respect to threat, it's somewhat it focuses on a coordinated assessment by the intelligence community, and so ostensibly you could have a high threat investor, and the vulnerability piece of the equation, that is what could be exploited by the US business to diminish national security, could be zero. And I used to be an engineer, but high threat times zero vulnerability equals zero risk. And so that's how we look at our world.
Great, thank you. Mike, do you want to touch this one?
Well, I think I commented on it before. I don't think there are any safe end users in China. It's because of their behavior and the laws they've passed. So civil-military fusion has a big bearing on this. If you don't know that, it really is law that says every commercial innovation that happens in China is available to the U.S. military. And I'll go more than that, is transferred to the U.S. military.
Chinese
military.
Yeah.
I'm sorry. Oh,
That's
my
okay.
goodness. Yeah.
U.S. military would be okay.
Yeah.
I have a joke about that, but we'll come back to it.
So, yeah, every Chinese innovation commercially transferred to the PLA.
Yeah.
And so I think that's quite problematic. And Xi himself oversees the apparatus to make sure that is the case. Then you combine that with the internet security law that they passed, which now they've spent 2 years figuring out how they're going to implement that. There's a great piece in China Law Blog that kind of explains the implications of that, which basically is the Chinese government, without permission, now has the ability to vacuum up anything that crosses Chinese networks, Chinese servers. Not clear whether that extends to Huawei equipment in the US or not, but it certainly extends to all the equipment in China, whether you're a forced joint venture, whether you're a foreign-owned entity. There will be no trade secrets. VPNs give you no protection in China. So if you take that at its limit, it means it doesn't matter who the user was that you thought you were transferring it to, it's all available to the Chinese government and therefore to the PLA.
Dave, what do you tell your clients?
Well, I think Mike put his finger on it with civil military fusion as being a very important thing for companies to know about when they're doing business in China. Another thing to keep in mind is that there's sort of this myth of the independent, private Chinese company. I think in China, being a private company is far different than being a private company in the United States, whether it's the series of laws that Mike is alluding to, or whether it's just the nature of having an authoritarian government and the Chinese Communist Party essentially able to reach out and touch you whenever they want to. I think there's very little recourse if a private Chinese company is told to transfer technology or data to benefit China's own security or intelligence. So I think that's important to keep in mind. But I think Tom's assessment of the formula is also very important to keep in mind.
So Eileen, you have to make these decisions every week, if not every day. What do you think about when you do it? Do you think, so we're having this discussion, is there anyone who can safely transfer stuff to in China? We might be the minority here by on the panel. So.
I think in every instance where we have an export license submitted, we look at roughly the risk factors that the CFIUS bodies look at. Who is the end user? What technology is actually being, well, how should I put this? Technology transfers are fewer and fewer. It is really, now most export licenses are commodities because we have taken concern to heart about the transfer of technology. Part of what we do too is what's already in China. What would the transfer give to China that it doesn't have now in terms of foundational perhaps or a little bit more than foundational. So it's a whole, you look at the entire transaction and not just a point in time but forward looking. What is it going to mean? The other thing that we take into account is the defense industrial base. If we deny this license application, what will be the ramifications for that U.S. company to provide innovation to our DoD partners and DoD industry in order to help us run faster in the future? It's complicated. I mean, it's very complicated, and cases take a long time. Not any longer than the executive order requires us to, but a long time.
Well, that's a relief. I still have more questions, but let me turn to you and see if we've got questions in the audience. Could I ask, hold up your hand, please identify yourself, and we'll go from my left to your right. Go ahead, please, you in the first row.
Second row.
Yeah, second row, sorry. So I can't count.
You, yes.
Okay. Thank you, reporter from the Voice of America. I have two questions related to Huawei. And recently, I think yesterday, Huawei said they invented its own chips. They're no longer dependent to US chips. So my question is it true that Huawei, if continuing blocking Huawei, blocking US companies from selling chips to China, will only hurting the US companies? The other one is about FCC said Monday that they're going to block some US companies funded with federal money to buy equipment from Huawei. And earlier this month, Huawei said, people said that they are in early talks with the US companies for transfer 5G to the US companies. So my question, I just wondering whether the panelists can clarify for me. So 5G technology itself has no threat at all, but the equipment made by Huawei will pose a national security threat to us. Thank you.
Anyone want to do that one? Well, I know a little about Huawei.
Go ahead.
The chip claim is probably exaggerated. There are some chips that China can make now. There are other chips that it could probably make in 2 or 3 years. And there's some chips it cannot make within a decade. So if the US were to cut off all chips to Huawei, it would not be able to make advanced telecom equipment. On the second point, many rural carriers, smaller carriers, as you know, in the US have depended on Huawei equipment. Back when we thought China was going to be a friend, it was a good deal for them to buy. I think that the FCC's intent was to signal that these smaller companies, smaller telcos, would no longer be able to rely on Huawei as a supplier. No major US carrier buys from Huawei. So it's fairly straightforward. The nature of telecommunications technology is changing rapidly, and the old vertical stacks that Huawei was very successful in are being replaced by horizontal stacks that involve software-defined networks, other technologies. So market's changing rapidly. Huawei and other vertical suppliers are being challenged, but for the next few years, of course, they'll have a very powerful position. Okay, we had other questions. I shouldn't be the one talking, by the way. We had one question there on the side, if you can maybe just toss the mic.
Thank you. I'm Alex Alper with Reuters, and I'm going to put you on the spot again, Eileen.
Oh, no, it's
Good.
Jim.
No, no,
Jim
Oh,
did
it's
help
just
me.
really- Okay. I was just wondering, I guess we brought up the sort of rulemaking process for the emerging and foundational. And I was just wondering if you had kind of a clearer timeline going forward for when we might see rule proposals in those two areas. And for Tom, I wanted to ask you, I guess, Mike had mentioned this issue of genetic data and how some Chinese companies have more access to US genetic data than US companies. And I wondered if that is going to be a priority in terms of CFIUS scrutiny going forward. Thank you.
So you should be seeing some proposed rules on emerging technologies shortly. All right. We intend to publish an advance notice of proposed rulemaking for a foundational. And again, our hope is that it should be out shortly, hopefully by the end of the calendar year.
Great. Genetic?
Yeah, with respect to genetics and priorities, I want to keep some of CFIUS's priorities close to the vest, but I will note that FIRMA, you may be aware, gave some authority with respect to non-controlling investments related to sensitive personal data and access to sensitive personal data that could be exploited for national security purposes. Our draft rule actually singles out genetic data as one of the categories we're concerned about.
So I used to teach a class at Georgetown on the defense industrial base, and one of the lectures was on enhanced soldier performance. And when I got to the section on enhancing soldier performance through genetic modification, the class went completely still. I don't know, Mike or Dave, if you want to, Dave, it's a little out of your remit, but Mike, you certainly live with us. Want to touch it at all? You can say no, but.
Well, I just say this is a really important area to understand, and I think we're on the very early stages of understanding what's possible, what are the implications, and it's very dangerous for China to have more data on our own citizens, combined with the stealing that's been done of many of our family histories or medical histories that maybe were stored at OPM. So China's putting together a pretty comprehensive set of data, and the combination of genetic sequencing with medical history, with family history, is pretty powerful if you talk to folks in genetics, in terms of realizing what could be done with true personalized medicine. So that has very dangerous implications, and I think it's something we need to be much more on top of than we are today.
Dave, you want to add anything to this?
No, I'll just mention that it was that was certainly an animating factor behind the CFIUS legislation, the issue of genetic data. And there's an FBI agent whose name is Ed Y-O-U, who's quite excellent, and he speaks publicly on this. He's testified, I think, before the U.S.-China Economic Security Review Commission, and you're not going to sleep well at night if you read what he says, but it's interesting and worth worth reading.
Okay.
Including, he's done some work recently to say how much of the pharmaceutical supply chain is dependent on China. So it's
We'll get
Scary.
to everyone, don't worry, but we've got some over here too that will work. I guess I have to stop bouncing back and forth, but go ahead, please.
Thank you. I'm Riho Aizawa, a member of a research group at George Washington University about mobilization of Chinese students and scholars and the technology espionage in Japanese universities especially. So about the university issue, could you talk more about how some Chinese students and scholars are usually hired to steal cutting-edge technology in the United States universities, and your ideas about countermeasures or preventive measures for that?
That's you.
I'll start. So there's a great article, if you haven't read it, called Picking Flowers, Making Honey. I recommend everyone read that. Pretty short, like 30 pages, which studies, and I think it's Australia.
Is
the source of this, how members of the PLA will disguise their background, apply to a graduate program, go to a university in the UK, Canada, the US, probably Japan too, to get specific information and then take that technology back home. Then that's the making honey part. So we benefit from a very open educational system, which I love and I'm sure you do too. But we have to recognize that this is part of China's comprehensive systematic plan to vacuum technology from around the world. So we can't just have the barn door open and let there be no consequences. So we unfortunately have to be more mindful of vetting some of the students and then putting in some basic protections. There's so many cases you can read about where Chinese students have taken research funded by the Department of Defense, goes back home to China, and then forms the basis of a supplier that is a supplier to the PLA. So we have to do more to raise the costs there.
Anyone else want to touch that one? No comment on it? I will say that this reinforces Mike's point about the need to increase the amount of counterintelligence resources we have. When you look at the number of Chinese students, which is several hundred thousand, and you think about, we can't tail them all, can't eavesdrop on them, what the heck are we going to do? So more resources, I think, would be the answer. Why don't we get a few over here and we'll bounce it back and forth. So this one here, go ahead. And identify yourself, please.
Okay, I probably don't need a mic, but anyway. So I am a mic, so I don't need a mic. So, my name is Mike Fritzy. I'm from the Potomac Institute. It's a question for Eileen. You've mentioned a couple of words on this, but I'd like your thoughts more specifically on the executive order, on the President's executive order on supply chain for ICT. I know Commerce is responsible for developing the implementation plan. So you've sort of mentioned a few things, but do you have any thoughts on that topic in particular, something you could share?
The only thing I can tell you is that it's under consideration and review at the department.
So not yet ready for...
Not yet ready for prime time.
That was concise. Can we let's go back to this side. Can we get one over here in the front, perhaps? Oh, right. We'll get you.
Alan Estevez from Deloitte. How you doing, guys? One quick comment. When I was the representative for CFIUS at the DoD, we used the Potter-Stewart identification method for what technologies we cared about. We know it when we saw it.
Yeah.
And of course, I had an extensive lab infrastructure in DARPA to rely on and programs to tell me when we cared about particular technologies. So whether it was on a list or not on a list, we could go out and do it under the FINSA capability. Under FIRMA, where you have some different authorities, becomes harder, which leads to my question, and this is for you, Tom. How are you going to identify those non-passive, non-controlling investments or unfiled in generals that you want to go after and stop under FIRMA?
It's a great question. It's another one that I'll probably keep a little close to my vest on how we're going to go about that, but I can tell you that in my view, one of the great strengths of CFIUS is that it's an interagency committee that's been around for almost 4 decades, and so there's not a lot of stovepiping with respect to how we work with one another and tackle potential national security risks that are before us or that we're looking for and identifying. We have the ability through the law, through what's called the non-notified process, to identify transactions of concern and invite the transaction parties to make a filing so we can take a closer look. The ability for us to reach back into DoD's subject matter experts or to bring other government agencies to the table and get their take on a technology or a particular U.S. business and the vulnerability that it poses. That's the strength of the interagency process. But I think as we grow in Treasury and enforcement office, we're going to spend more focused time on non-notifieds and finding transactions that concern the U.S. government. So I won't go into more detail than that, but we're working on it.
Okay, on this side, perhaps we've got one. We'll get everyone, don't worry, we've got plenty of time. They may not have plenty of time.
Hey y'all, my name is Julian Kyle Lewis from the American University here in Washington. It was mentioned on stage that 1/4 of the STEM major graduates are from Asian countries. And I was wondering, as much as we frown upon using stereotypes to judge folks and how our children are brought up psychologically, the stereotype that Asians are smart has been very permanent in American history. And it's really affecting the way that all of our children view themselves and their potential in relation to their Asian classmates. Because if I had an Asian student in my class, I'm cheating off their paper if I can, if it was an option. But that's, what do y'all think about how that has affected our education system, just from elementary school up to college and graduate school, as we're seeing? Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Can I make one comment? I appreciate your comments, and I think it's important that this not become a case of xenophobia. And I was one who spoke about how important immigration is to our economic prosperity. So the comments that I made about China, and Dave and I were the ones who talked about China, really have to do with the Chinese Communist Party. It's really focused on the regime. Who could not have respect for the long history and tremendous cultural contribution that China's made throughout history? So I count myself as one of those admirers of what the Chinese people have done and what their culture brings to the world. My beef is with the practices of the Communist Party and them making students in particular agents for their illicit technology transfer to China.
Okay, great. Do we have any on this side? Why don't we'll try and bounce them around. Can we get over here in the front there? And then we'll get you, Miriam. I see you. And please introduce yourself.
Hi, I'm Matt Tracy. I work with Reorg Covering Mergers and Acquisitions. This question's for Tom Beto.
Oop, dead mic. Hold on.
Can you hear me better now?
Yep.
So my question is pretty technical. In the past, before FIRMA, CFIUS jurisdiction did not cover joint ventures between Chinese firms and foreign incorporated U.S. subsidiaries. And so technology transfer issues involved in such JVs were left to export control agencies. If any technology transfer to China was U.S. derived. Does a subtle change in the definition of a U.S. business under FIRMA give CFIUS the option of now finding that foreign subsidiaries of U.S. firms are U.S. businesses and thus their JVs with China could in fact be covered by CFIUS jurisdiction?
So thanks for the question. We just finished the open comment period on the regulations, and what we've promulgated is the draft regulation. I'll note first that to the extent a joint venture was being created where a U.S. business was being essentially contributed to that joint venture, and we took a look at that transaction, and the foreign person had control over a U.S. business by virtue of how that joint venture was structured. That hasn't been outside of CFIUS's jurisdiction, just to be clear. So now in terms of the definition of U.S. business, I'll just note at this point, because we're still working on the draft rule, that the definition promulgated in the draft rule is consistent with the statutory definition in FIRMA. So the draft rule is the language in FIRMA on that point, and I'll just leave it at that for now.
Great, thank you. Miriam.
Hi there. Is it working?
Yes.
Miriam Sapiro, Sard Rabinin, and a survivor of CFIUS. Pre-FIRMA, post-Dubai ports.
Yeah.
And the question I have, primarily for Tom, but not exclusively so, is over the years, there would be talk informally of whether there should be a blacklist or a whitelist. And now FIRMA sets up the authority for the U.S. government to do that. And the draft regs look like it's moving towards a whitelist or accepted state. So the question is, if you can share anything with us as to whether you're thinking potentially of a handful of states, and then how do you deal with the second handful that isn't on that list that wants to be? You get into some very challenging issues. So any sense as to how you're actually going to differentiate? If you are, well, are you going to actually set up a so-called whitelist, and how are you going to make these difficult decisions and deal with allies and partners who are disappointed?
So thank you for the question. It's a little bit complicated, and I'll rely on my colleague here to help me with a little bit of the legislative history. But at one point, as FIRMA was being drafted and debated and considered and refined, I think that the House version of the bill had blacklist language, and the Senate version of the bill explicitly had a whitelist approach. And then in the course of the sausage making, what fell out was no list, at least not explicitly. There is language with regard to our new jurisdiction over the non-controlling, non-passive investments, where we're required to, through a phrase, country specification, to modify our jurisdiction with our reach with respect to the new jurisdiction. Has nothing to do, whitelist or blacklist does not apply to our traditional control jurisdiction. And so right now the draft rule talks about accepted foreign states. And I think the preamble mentions that when the rule is finalized, there will be a limited list of countries that are publicized as accepted foreign states. And I think we'll continue to contemplate who is on that list and how it may or may not grow and change over time. One of the things that the draft rule talks about too is those countries that are published when the rule is finalized as accepted foreign states have a grace period of 2 years to develop a investment screening tool or mechanism that satisfies the United States government that it's adequate and does something similar to what we do with respect to national security. So whatever countries are listed on that limited list when the rule is finalized, or by the time the rule is finalized, they'll have 2 years to demonstrate to the United States that they deserve to remain on the list. Again, that limitation as an accepted foreign state only applies to our new jurisdiction.
Dave, I seem to remember this debate, and I think some of us favored a blacklist because it would be very short. You want to take us back to why you went this way, or why you think the Congress went this way?
Well, the original drafts of the bill that we worked on in the Senate, when I worked with Senator Cornyn in his office, we did take a negative list approach, but it was really tricky to decide, what is the sort of one country that this transaction kind of goes back to. How do you put it? How do you simplify that? It was very challenging, especially with complicated structures these days. So. And what Tom's talking about is really important, the ability to use this positive list concept to create an incentive for other countries to stand up their own foreign investment screening process, because other countries have good technology as well. Obviously, the Germans, the Israelis, the Japanese, other European countries, South Korea. And so we, from a national security standpoint, it's in our best interest to have these other countries take the same kind of approach with their technology that we take, and not have potential adversaries acquire, technology that's just as good or 90% as good through another country. So I think there's going to be a growing, kind of a growth period as they work out the details of the positive list here, the accepted foreign states. But I think it is going to have an effect, will be beneficial for national security in the long run once they get it all figured out, once transactions and investors and companies sort of shape the way they're doing things to take advantage of that opportunity. So I think it was a good policy choice, and they're doing a good job with it. It's very tricky.
Mike, does this come into the DIU world? I mean, you must have companies in Silicon Valley that are multinational. I mean, how do you deal with it?
So part of our consideration set is, what does the foreign ownership look like? And you can imagine that we're very wary of setting up as a supplier to the Defense Department supply chains that we feel would compromise defense. So our process is open and public in terms of encouraging more companies to participate in solicitations. Overwhelming number of winners are U.S. technology firms, but we have had awards to other countries. They have been Five Eye countries.
Oh, okay. Great. Eileen, you're in the list business, so what do you do? What do you think about this? You have both positive and negative lists. Do you have a...
We do have a positive and negative lists, and it varies according to, it really varies according to the technology. A blacklist is, or a negative list, obviously that's totally don't deal and no issues. And sometimes really when you think about it, you might not engage with the transaction that might be good because the country or company happens to be on the blacklist. So it varies.
Okay. Can we get some over here? Do we have questions? How about right in front of you there? Thanks, Sonia.
Thanks. My name's Carl Schonander. I'm with the Software and Information Industry Association. Speaking about other countries, I'm kind of curious if the panelists could talk about sort of allies' general views on the challenges stemming from China. Are they beginning to share a U.S. perspective? Not so. Obviously, countries will take different views on specific transactions. For example, Chancellor Merkel just decided to let Huawei into their markets, but that doesn't necessarily mean, for example, that the EU doesn't share some aspects of U.S. concerns. So I'm wondering if you could speak to that. Thanks. Bye.
I've spent some time with the defense communities of some of the Five Eyes countries. I would say they very much share the concerns that we have with China.
I was talking to an EU official last week. This is anecdotes, but he said they were about 2 years behind, but on the same trajectory as we are when it comes to China. So, anyone else? You're doing some work with partner countries. It's in the legislation.
So I can, point out that to your point about the EU spent a lot of time in 2018 building out a draft regulation that they finalized and approved at the beginning of this year to basically foster and encourage their member states to build out national security investment screening mechanisms. About half of them already have something, but since that happened, quite a few countries that did not are working on investment screening mechanisms and have reached out to the United States government for help and benchmarking and advice. Canada has a very robust mechanism. Australia does as well. There are a number of countries that are paying a great deal of attention to, the fact that some foreign investment is not benign.
Great, thank you. Eileen, you have to do this again almost every day. You're a multilateral agency. What does you think about when?
I think there are some countries who are, as you say, coming to the realization that some countries may pose a threat to their economic national security. It's not necessarily focused solely on one country. There are other countries that some of the EU countries are dealing with. It's a tough process. I mean, it's not a tough process. It's providing information, more information, and more information, so that a decision can be reached that is defendable. Because there are some countries whose, in terms of export controls, in order to deny a license, there really has to be some hardcore information. So it's a matter of building. It's a matter of providing additional information and building that case.
Do you want to add anything, Dave?
No, I'm good, thanks.
We're getting a little short on time, so how about if we start grouping questions? Let's start by grouping them in twos. If we can get 2 questions on this side, can people hold up their hands if they've got them? We've got one here and one here. Yeah.
My name is Tony Spadaro. Dave, you mentioned that one of the things we should seek to do is, in the case where technology is stolen, to prevent the stealing country from monetizing the advantage of that. I'd like to understand better how we could actually do that, considering the fact that a lot of our current approaches tend to be bilateral as opposed to multilateral.
And then the second question. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Masaki Arai from NHK TV, and this is a question for Mr. Brown. So you have been a very leading advocate to regulate Chinese investment in Silicon Valley, and then recently we saw some Chinese companies laying off employees or reducing investment in Silicon Valley. So do you think your strategy is working?
On the monetizing of IP theft, I think there are sort of 2 separate categories when you're looking at IP theft by a foreign actor. There's those foreign actors that want to essentially use that US IP to make stuff and sell it back into the US market, and there's those that want to purely sell it in overseas markets. And I think with regard to those that want to sell it in the US in some way, really there's a mechanism under the International Trade Commission, Section 337, I think, of the Tariff Act. I can't remember the exact statute, but there's a process that companies where their IP is being infringed upon, typically in patent cases, they can bring sort of a quasi litigation before an administrative law judge, I believe. I'm not an expert on this, but the process, unfortunately, if you think someone is making something and selling it using your stolen IP, can take anywhere from 10 to 16, 18 months to get resolution. And the problem is that during that period, the bad actor is making money hand over fist with your stolen IP. And so there needs to be a quicker, more modern, more relevant mechanism. So perhaps an adjustment to that statute to allow for, if there's an order out of the ITC, I believe the CBP can go and literally seize the product, stop the importation of these goods. But there's got to be some faster way to do it to stop the monetization of that. And then overseas, it's much more difficult. If they're not bothering to sell it back in the U.S., they just want to sell it overseas. There have been cases of U.S. radios that were based on pirated technology that were sold to the Philippine government, for example. It's much harder to reach those kinds of situations. I think that's where the economic sanctions really come into play. And if they rely on U.S. suppliers to use the entity list to really cut off their supply chain, so they literally can't make the stuff. All these tools should be brought to bear, depending on the facts, in a way to prevent them from making money.
We actually had an example of we put on a fab in China, Zhenhua, and they were accused of stealing IP from Micron. It was an export control violation, but our concern was that because of what Zhenhua was producing, the possibility that they would supplant Micron, and Micron was an important supplier to the Defense Department, that we put Zhenhua on the entity list, and it basically closed down the fab. So there are, mechanisms and tools, depending, I think, on the specific circumstances. On the entity list, it was a DoD supply chain issue that really brought the entity to the entity list, but there are other tools that can be used.
Congress deserves a lot of credit for that one. That was a
really
good call.
Yay.
And I just want to clarify, your question was basically because of the work that's been done by all of us here on the stage, has it made a difference in terms of Chinese investment in early stage technologies, which is what the report was on? I think the answer is basically no. Part of that is we don't have the rules in place yet. So the work that was done on FIRMA and export control still rules being written. So, and then I'll cite some work from Bloomberg. And this is available in the U.S. Trade Representative's report. I think there was a report that was done last fall, about November, that updated the data since the DIUX report. They basically said that they quoted the Rhodium Group, while foreign direct investment from China was down 90% year over year. That must have been 2018 over 2017. And that was as a result of capital controls in China, and China being explicit that they did not want to be investing in broad real estate, entertainment. You might remember that certain CEOs had been detained, Dalian Wanda, On Buying Insurance, Chinese companies that basically were taking a worldwide conglomerate approach. So a lot of that has been stopped. However, and this was the Bloomberg data that was cited in that US Trade report, in technology, there had been no decrease in the amount of investment. So these issues very much alive, and I'm anxious for us to have the apparatus to look at them more closely.
Why don't we get two on this side? That was not a happy answer, Mike. Holy cow.
If we understand how critical China views technology to transform their economy, there's no wonder that they're very focused on this and have a number of different ways to transfer the technology legally and illegally. This is something they view as a very high priority.
I hope we can come back to that at the end. We're close to the end. Why don't we do the two in the front and then the two in the back, and then we'll give this section a last chance. So,
excuse me, Brad Fortnum with Inside U.S. Trade. The forced technology transfers and intellectual property rights are at the very core of the Section 301 tariffs the Trump administration has put on China. What role can those trade negotiations play in alleviating the concerns you've raised with China? And this is meant for Mike and Eileen.
And then behind you, I think there was one. Thanks.
Thank you, Eddie Saman. I'm a recent graduate in international relations. I was wondering, there have been calls recently on Congress to ban or regulate facial recognition over privacy concerns, and also at least to prevent private companies like Amazon to write their own federal laws. I was wondering, how does that affect national security if it does happen, and considering that countries like China have had a faster growth rate in this field, like you have mentioned. Thank you.
Great. Two good questions. Anyone want to start? I can do facial recognition.
Sure.
I'm nervous about bans because it's a good way to make sure you fall behind. And there are strong privacy concerns and equity concerns with facial recognition, but we know that other countries, Russia, for example, and China have done quite well in developing this technology. I would not want to see the U.S. Remove itself from the contest by banning it. And, I don't know if others have views, but.
That's good.
On the second question.
Hands are blunt.
301.
Oh, first question.
Yes, so your question was really how the trade negotiations can affect these issues at the core, IP theft, right? So I think we have to wait and see what happens as a result of the trade negotiations. I don't think there's much detail yet. I, like you, hope that we get to those core issues.
Dave, now that you're out, you can touch this one.
I can say whatever I want to. I would say, hope for the best, but maybe expect the worst. I'm just not sure that we should realistically expect that China's going to restructure in terms of forced tech transfer and IP theft. These things are baked into the tech acquisition strategy that Mike has been talking about, that the FBI calls the wheel of doom. If you've seen the unclassified slide, I just don't think it's realistic to think that trade talks are going to yield that kind of outcome. But maybe I'm pessimistic.
I think do we have two more on this side or one more? We have two more, and then we'll come close to an end.
Thank you. Katie Stetch with the Wall Street Journal. Since government timeline questions are hot today, Eileen, when do you expect by the end of this week that there'll be license applications granted for U.S. suppliers that want to do business with Huawei? And for Mr. Feddo, the last report that Treasury released on companies that went through the CFIUS process is 2015. Do you know when the next annual report will be out, and can you explain why it takes so long?
Well, those were easy, thank you.
Yeah, they were. So the Huawei licenses that we have received are continued to be in process. I have no estimate as to when a resolution will happen.
Something tells me that's going to be in the paper tomorrow. Go ahead.
Yeah, so
source.
I appreciate the question about the data. I know it's important, and I've identified this is something that we need to catch up on. I'm not in the business of giving excuses, so your explanations question will have to go unanswered, but in the very near future, we'll have more data on our website that catches up to where we should be.
What can you say? Exactly. Great. Do we have one in the front? I think we did. Go ahead, one up here. Almost done.
Hi, I'm Catherine. I'm an analyst at JAB. I had a question for Tom. So with China, they just rolled out a new semiconductor fund to fund their own semiconductor development. This is their third one, and I think it's their largest one to date. So there's going to be billions of dollars to fund their development, potentially acquisitions abroad. How does that factor in? I understand you're looking at case by case, but if there is a strategic objective and lots of money behind acquiring a bunch of semiconductors, does that fit into some of your assessments?
Well, I think to the extent there's a strategy to acquire certain technology, that's going to inform, for example, our non-notified work to identify transactions that reflect that strategy, and we'll take a look at those.
Semiconductors is a good topic, though, so I think everyone here has touched on it in some way. Why don't I start with Mike and say, when you look at semiconductors in the U.S., what are your concerns? What would you want to do? I mean, you live out in Silicon Valley, so that's why it's called Silicon. What do you think?
Well, this is clearly one of the foundational technologies, foundational in the 1970s and foundational today. Absolutely critical for both economic prosperity and national security. Made in China 2025, explicitly, you just have to read it to say they want to control 70% of the global market share of semiconductors. If they're successful, where does that come? It comes from US and European suppliers, and their industrial policy is to basically hollow out that world-class capability we and European nations enjoy. That's a big problem for us.
Eileen, if you look at the people who make SME, semiconductor manufacturing equipment, they're largely American, Japanese, and I think there's one European company still. When those things come in, what do you do with them? How do you look at them? Who's buying the stuff now?
I mean, the market is primarily China for buying those things, and how we look at them is really what exactly is being provided. What are they going to be manufacturing? What is the investment on return for U.S. industries to run faster? So all those things are taken into consideration.
Dave, you had anything on?
No, I think Mike put his finger on it. I mean, it'd be hard to overstate the importance for both national security and also for our just long-term economy of semiconductors. Both from a supply chain kind of integrity standpoint and also just from a availability standpoint. If all of our chips are made in China or Taiwan, we certainly know how China feels about Taiwan, 90 miles off their coastline. That could really be put in jeopardy if hostilities ever broke out. Hopefully, far in the future. Hopefully, never. But relying on Taiwanese-made chips, not having our own fabs here in the U.S. is really short-sighted. I know the Defense Department is, according to the news, is working on some strategies right now to address that. So hopefully that bears fruit.
Tom, there used to be a lot of semiconductor cases involving China had a strategy, it looks like, to acquire U.S. companies, and that's largely gone away. What does it look like now to you? Is it still something to?
Yeah, so we look at semiconductor related transactions or that implicate semiconductors with some frequency. And I don't see that changing. And it's critically important to the warfighter. The semiconductors are involved with everything we do everywhere, all the time, but they're also what are the guts of a lot of things that make sure that we have warfighting superiority. And so I fully expect that the committee will continue to spend a great deal of time on those types of transactions.
I will say, and anyone can react to it if they want. Were you going to say something?
Nope.
This is another one that's come up. You might remember the old trusted foundry battle over the last more than a decade. And what's always happened is that the U.S. government sees the price tag and chokes. Right? So maybe it will be different this time, but if there's one advantage the Chinese have, it's that they're willing to spend money.
Yes.
Right? And so, when you talk about a fab, when you talk about a foundry, you're talking about multi-billion-dollar investments. So the way I try and explain it sometimes is it's just one aircraft carrier.
Maybe half one.
We'll see. Okay, we've almost exhausted our panel. I hope they're not too exhausted to answer two related questions that I'm going to put to them. First of all, you've all touched on this, but maybe you can just restate for a conclusion. What is it we should be doing? And I'll go down the row. And the second question related to that is, what is it going to take to get us to do that? So, Tom, why don't I start with you?
Oh, good.
Well, so I think we've all sort of touched on this. I mean, I think the United States government did something last year with FIRMA, and they gave us tools. CFIUS, the committee, hadn't been updated and modernized and strengthened for a generation. And after very, very careful thought and a lot of hard work from people like Dave and senators and congressmen thinking this through, classified briefings, really carefully considering what we needed to do our job, they gave us an incredible set of tools, and in a way that allows us to be nimble and to respond where we need to. I think remembering that CFIUS is just one tool in the national security toolbox, and so they've given us they've given us very clear direction, and we're going to run with it, and we'll see how it goes.
Great, thank you, Dave.
We need to implement the legislation that Tom's working on right now, which is really important, to make sure that all those agencies have the proper staffing and resourcing, which is not clear to me that everybody's doing that. We need to tackle the IP theft issue, as I mentioned, some sort of framework, some sort of policy to better address that. We need to rearrange our, sort of take a new approach, a new mindset on government spending. Mike's organization, this may break Mike's heart, but we should probably triple Mike's budget. And there's a lot of other entities like DIU. Well, there's only one DIU, but there's other related affiliated entities. We need to do more of that. We need to heal the sort of wounds between the government and Silicon Valley, which are deep and long-standing. That's really important. So I think I'll leave it at that.
Well, first I'd like to express my appreciation and admiration for what Tom and Eileen are doing, because it's easy to talk about this issue, but they have to come up with the brass tacks of what are we going to do. So I really appreciate the hard work they're doing. But as much as we focus on the defensive issues here, we've got to really summon the will to demand that we be preeminent in science and we focus on technology investment, which will lead to the economic prosperity of the next couple of decades. So this is all about what are we going to do from a proactive standpoint to make sure we're building economic prosperity. And technology is the key for the future to that, and commercial tech is the key to that. We got to be making sure our private industry is taking the long-term view, and that requires some difficult changes in how our capital markets work, so we're not so focused on short-term and sending things all offshore. So that hard work needs to be done, but most importantly, research, development, technology innovation, that's going to be the key to keeping the U.S. leading in these game-changing technologies.
Yeah. First of all, I want to thank Jim for starting at that end of the panel, because I can say I agree with it all. But more importantly, in my world in export controls, we can't be short-sighted. We can't say deny this export license because we don't want that to happen. When in a lot of instances, in some instances, that export license is what generates the revenue for U.S. industry to be innovative, to run faster. And sometimes we really do need to look at the broad range of technologies, look at foundational to see how that might impact our national security, obviously look at emerging. But is there a slice in between, maybe on a commodity basis, where export licenses, export controls can be useful in providing the commodities that would perhaps delay significantly the indigenization, whatever, in China of certain commodities. So I really think we need to take a very balanced approach, use all the tools in our toolbox, but not to the point where it's a sledgehammer, because I think that will only result in perhaps U.S. companies going offshore.
Great. So in 2004, one of the first reports I ever wrote at CFIUS was called Waiting for Sputnik. And it was about how we had to increase spending on R&D and STEM. In 2008, there was a report, Rising Above the Gathering Storm, from the National Academies that said largely the same stuff, although with a more august set of authors. We had DIUX under Secretary Carter. When was that, 2016?
2015 started.
2015, yeah. Now in 2017, we've got this very powerful set of legislation. So we're moving in the right direction, but I think the panel today, while very informative, was also a little disquieting, because I think the question I'll leave you all with is, we're moving in the right direction, but are we moving fast enough? So with that, please join me in thanking our panelists.
Thank you.